Hello and welcome to the Augustana Human Library. The title of today's human book is Unguarded Authenticity, and this is the human book's abstract. The most valuable lesson that I uncovered through my gender transition was that of my decades of personal struggle were never about being transgender, but rather about being human. This epiphany helped me to recognize a fundamental bond between us all, that we all, at our core, we share a need for self-actualization and are all in transition towards a more authentic version of ourselves. Thank you for being here today, and welcome Unguarded Authenticity.
So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to do just a really quick background just so you know about me, and then I will dive in. I love doing this session because it's not a worky one. It's not a training. It's actually just my story, which I think oftentimes we talk about it a lot in training. The power of storytelling is pretty incredible as far as just garnering some understanding and engagement. And Nancy and I were just talking about it, putting a face to lots of the language and the challenges and that are so prevalent in media these days, certainly around gender diversity and transgender folks. So my background, my first 20 years of my career is actually in the oil and gas world, as in the energy industry. I started as a geologist. After 5 or 6 years, moved into the onto a leadership path, worked my way up into a senior level leadership position in the organization. And so when I went through my gender transition, I did that in that workplace as a senior leader, and that really garnered a lot of the experience and knowledge that I bring to the work that I do now. So I will share more about that in the story. So I'll stop there. I stayed in that world for a few years after transition, and honestly, it went relatively well. It was relatively well supported. The reality was my passion and heart just started to shift and started to do more advocacy work and got way more interested in just the inclusion of kind of non-dominant, underrepresented, equity deserving groups, whatever language you use. And so kind of did a 180. Went back to school, got an undergrad in psych from Queen's University, and then I'm just finishing my master's in psych from Yorkville University. So just on the last couple months of my my clinical part of that. So that is kind of the lens I bring to this conversation. More personally, as you will see, I am still married to my high school sweetheart who I asked out in grade 11. We've got 2 kids. Who are, how old are they now? 13 and 15. So they're all part of the story. So it'll all kind of come together. But that's who I am. My pronouns are she and her. So what I'm going to do first, and because it's a small group, I'm hoping that we'll go through kind of the story and then open it up for any questions. I want all of you to know and trust that I am a completely open book. I really believe in this work. Can everyone see that okay? I really believe in this work that that oftentimes to change the conversation, we need to have the conversation. And I have the great privilege of a lot of support in my life, which gives me a lot of emotional bandwidth to do that. So please trust that there is no bad question. There is no wrong word to say. There is nothing other than openness with respect to learning about this world, if you haven't. So to kick off, I don't know where all of you are, but I am in Southern Alberta. So I want to take a moment just in the spirit of reconciliation to certainly acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which for me include the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Axe, the Nakota Nation, the Métis Nation, Region 3, and all of the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So I definitely ask everyone, if you wouldn't mind just taking a moment to yourself, just acknowledge where we are, where you're coming from today. In doing this land acknowledgement, I certainly also want to recognize the privilege I have given my settler history that I have had and continue to have because of that. Recognizing that on a daily basis is an incredibly important step to move towards as we move towards reconciliation. So the very first slide I always show is kind of my disclaimer slide. I always use the example when I'm doing this in corporate spaces of, when you do like investor presentations, and there's that first slide with really tiny words, and that's their like disclaimer of forward-looking statements and stuff. This is kind of my version of that. I shared with you at the beginning, certainly I am an open book with any and all aspects of my story. I think those conversations are impactful and can help create comfort for others, as well as some understanding. However, at the beginning of the session, I always want to just give a little bit of a reminder that everybody is not in the same place. So it's this is what I'm going to share with you today is very much my story, my perspective, my personal journey through this. And I certainly don't want any kind of assumption that this is everybody else's story. There's a really, really good quote that a friend told me years ago. She said, if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person, which I think applies to all of us, quite honestly. I don't think that's just a trans thing. So yeah, the other analogy I always use is it's very often in this community when somebody's going through transition or working through this journey, there is this implicit, like with others, feels like it gives people permission to ask questions. I kind of use the analogy of, I remember when my spouse was pregnant and everybody touching her, like grabbing her belly and stuff without permission. I kind of think this is the same kind of idea. So just always make sure you're supporting and safe for others who may be going through this. All right. So as we jump in, I want to just give a bit of a trigger warning for sure, is we will talk about my own challenges with mental health, suicide, and things like that. I think it's, going back to where I started, I think it's incredibly important when I'm telling a story of authenticity to tell it in a very authentic way. So when I was first building this a bunch of years ago, I realized I was kind of sitting too much on the surface, which doesn't do this topic justice. So I'm going to tell my story in a very authentic and personal way, in the hopes that that just helps bring some kind of compassion, understanding with respect to the challenges that folks in this community may be facing. So with that intro, this is, I say my story, but this is really our story. This is my family's story as we navigated through this. The first thing I will tell you is that I would have definitely told this story a heck of a lot different before I transitioned. It was, through so many of those years, which we'll talk about, I spent so much of that journey struggling and feeling alone, and honestly feeling a lot of like anger and resentment that I had to deal with this thing that I thought was so unique and nobody else had to deal with. And I was almost always kind of jealous or resentful that nobody had to deal with something this big. And so I worked through a lot of those years with quite a bit of anger, to be honest with you. But then I went through transition, and almost in this, there was just this great twist of irony. It was in the days and kind of weeks following that announcement that I came to appreciate the struggle, all the struggle in my life up to that point, had never really been about being trans. It was really about this journey to authenticity. And it was this really kind of, aha moment in this entire journey. And the reason that happened, it was in that act of being vulnerable. When somebody's going through this, you have no choice. It's not like I had to be stronger than someone else. It's just, you've got no choice but to be really vulnerable as you navigate through this. But what that vulnerability did was open this door with so many others in my life. And I got this gift of conversation and people sharing their own challenging adversities back with me. So many of these kind of inner plot things that we don't know each other is struggling with. And it was this huge aha moment, and it made me realize that there is this kind of fundamental connection between all of us. And at our core, we are all working towards self-actualization in some form or another. And in so many ways, we are all always in transition to a more authentic version of ourselves. So I start there because I honestly don't want this story to be about being transgender. I don't think that's the point. Instead, I hope that, you know, my story helps bridge a bit of understanding, you know, between the trans and cis communities, and really with, you know, built with this realization of how similar we all are. I hope that listening to the story just can help remind us all of how important it is to have the courage to prioritize your own personal self-care, whatever that means to you. And I think most importantly, I hope it serves as a reminder that we are all facing the exact same challenge of putting ourselves out there, taking off a mask and living authentically. And I think if we think about it like that, if we're all facing that same hurdle, then maybe it's as easy as just supporting each other as we're all, you know, on that journey to get there. I always say in more of the advocacy work, I said, if we just celebrated authenticity instead of being so damn concerned at what authenticity looks like for each of us, I think this all gets so much, so much easier. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to have a bit of fun with this one, but the very first counseling session I went to, I was introduced to the theory of human motivation. So published by Maslow over 75 years ago. So he, in that publication, he published what he called the hierarchy of human needs. And I remember that first session of counseling, and I remember the counselor patiently kind of walking through it with me, and, you know, the difference between safety, love, and belonging, physiological, and self-actualization. And I took notes carefully, like I did. I didn't really say anything. And then I took it away and I did my own research and reading. And I remember going back to her about a week later with this very, very well thought out response of why she had no idea what she was talking about. And if she thought anything I was going through was that simple, then clearly I wasn't the one that needed the counseling. I was a slow learner. It took me about a decade to realize that she was right, but Maslow's kind of, or the principles that he published, definitely kind of came to light. So now I want to hit the brakes because the hierarchy of human needs was published by Maslow, but I want to definitely take a moment to acknowledge it was not all Maslow's idea. I was doing this session a few years ago, and somebody, an individual from the Indigenous community, came up and shared this history with me, which I really, really, really appreciated, and I've changed this talk ever since. So this is a photo from the Glenbow archives of Maslow visiting the Blackfoot Reserve in southern Alberta in 1938. The hierarchy of human needs and the theory of human motivation mirrors incredibly well or incredibly consistently to Blackfoot teachings in the Indigenous community. So I want to acknowledge not Maslow. I want to acknowledge the the Blackfoot teachings with respect to the hierarchy of human needs. I love this photo. He published the hierarchy of human needs in 1942, so it was about 4 or 5 years after he did this tour of the Siksika Reserve in southern Alberta. So just to bring that lens back into it. So what they proposed was this idea that for any of us to meet our full potential, a series of needs must be met. So at the base of that pyramid, we've got physiological needs. We need all those things just to kind of survive. We need food, we need water, we need sleep, all those kind of needs. Once those are satisfied, then we continually work up the pyramid. So then we we position ourselves in communities with others who provide safety and security to us. On top of that, we pull in and start focusing on love and belonging. Once all those things are in place, then we start to build self-esteem or confidence, self-confidence in ourselves. At the top of this pyramid, I think very appropriately at the top of this pyramid is the step of self-actualization. And going back to where we started, I think this is a challenge for all of us. This is not just a trans thing. This is what all of us are continually working towards. For me, in my story, as you'll see, this last step of self-actualization at the time meant risking all of the layers of that triangle I had worked hard for decades to build up, like, and to take that last big step, I had to learn a lot of things. I had to learn how to actually be vulnerable. I had to learn to find peace in the uncertainty and let go of this constant impulse to figure everything out before I did anything. You'll see some examples of that as I share the trajectory of my story. I'm a planner. I don't like doing things that feel uncertain, and there's no option or choice for this to be anything but uncertain. But I think most importantly, and hopefully a theme that folks take away is I really had to learn to love myself. And I had to take from this world what I needed to be happy so that I could honestly and genuinely start to give the most of myself back. And with that, we go right to the beginning. So this is me right at the start. I tease my mom to this day that the reason I was so happy in this photo is because for some reason she put me in tights, and I was excited to be wearing a feminine piece of clothing as this little kid. So starting at, I was, my life growing up was absolutely supported and loving. All of those physiological, the safety needs were met in spades. I was the second son, born in 1980 in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. I was followed by two sisters that came after me. And by the time our family was complete, there were two boys and two girls. And until my transition, my dad always made the joke of how he did that on purpose. And he got the perfect balance of gender in his kids. My life growing up was, for the most part, happy. And I think this is really important to mention, because I think one thing that's come with the advent of YouTube and all the things is we see all these young kids who are, jumping up and down and throwing things and really, really strongly willed that they're not the sex they were assigned at birth. And while those stories are very, very valid and true, from my experience, certainly in the advocacy world, it's not the common story. I think it's, lots of kids in this space are much more introspective. They're trying to figure it out as they go, which is the result of which leaves lots of parents feeling very blindsided when it does come up. So I was a happy kid. I didn't often rebel. I was that kid that just wanted my parents to be proud of me. And I was always doing things to try and make them happy. The first memory I have, I was 6 or 7 when I really started to kind of get uncomfortable, or notice and get uncomfortable with the gender lines that were drawn in the 80s, and unfortunately in so many ways still exist for kids today. And having that older brother and one younger sister at that time, I was given daily examples of what was considered appropriate for my gender. I remember the moment with my sister that we're really, really close. And I remember the moment with her that I realized that I couldn't make myself a girl. I couldn't make myself like her just by changing clothes, or by doing the activities that she wanted to do. And I remember that kind of rupture with her, because it was that, going back to that theme of resentment, I loved and adored her until I realized that she got this thing that I could never have. And instead of loving and idolize her, I ended up starting to resent her and feel angry about it as we grew up. And since I knew and figured out I couldn't be like her, I turned to my brother to define, what were the appropriate behavioral and expression goalposts of the 1980s. In small town Saskatchewan, I concluded that, that he was the definition of normal. And certainly in my family, as long as I did what he did, I was pretty safe, and there was no repercussions from behaving just like he did. And I don't know, I'm guessing parents on the call today. Well, there's one parent because we saw a baby, at least. But I always share this story with a lot of laughter, because I know other parents probably have done this as well. But I remember what I call like the drive-by that my mom did with the puberty books. Is she got them from the community association, then walked down the hallway and threw the blue one in my brother in my room and threw the pink one in my sister's room. And nothing more was ever spoken about him. She was hoping we'd absorb them. So she brought home those two books. And I remember obviously flipping through the blue one first and learning about all the things that happen to boys as they enter puberty. And then I flipped to the pink one and read about all the things that happen for girls. And I want to make note at this point that at that age, at 8 years old, both those books are equally terrifying. When you're a kid at that age. But really more importantly, why I share this part of the story is this introduction to puberty made me realize that there was this defining point in my life on the horizon. And I genuinely believed that, upon puberty, all was going to be revealed. And I was so convinced that puberty was going to launch me into womanhood. And without having to explain it or figure out how to have this conversation, my gender identity would just become obvious to everyone. And then mom would have to deal with it and dad would have to help. And that's when everybody would know. So I share that because those years between that point and puberty, I honestly, they were the happiest years of my childhood because I just believed it was going to fix itself. I excitedly waited for puberty so that it would all just start to happen for me. But of course, you all know how that turned out. All those things in the blue book just began to pop into my life, and each one at that time was an absolute waking nightmare. I've got so much empathy for this stage of life for trans and gender diverse kids because it is really, really hard. I remember standing in front of the mirror, plucking every single hair that popped out of my, face until I couldn't keep up anymore. I remember the sick feeling when my voice began to drop and change. And at the point, it just felt so helpless and, and confusing. None of it made sense to me. And we have to ground ourselves in the 80s. There was no internet. There was very few books. There was no information on this. And it felt really, really uncertain. However, as far as anyone else knew, my teen years were golden. I had many, many, many privileges. I was successful in school. I was involved in extracurriculars and had lots of friends. I, followed brothers' footsteps. I ended up as captain of the football team and even voted Mr. Football in my senior year at my high school. So when we think about it in context of Maslow's pyramid or the Blackfoot teachings, my pyramid was pretty full, and the perception was that it was pretty full. But the reality was, through these years, when I closed my eyes, none of that success ever felt like it was mine. It felt like a performance. And, I was working so hard for people to be proud of me. And no matter how proud of me people were, it never felt like it was an accomplishment. When I opened my eyes in the morning, I never felt confident about who I was. But what I learned in those days was that as much as I struggled inside, I learned to work incredibly hard to achieve success. And I learned that by doing that was the best way to protect your truth in our society is to be successful and to maintain kind of that quote unquote normal. So essentially, I got really, really, really good at hiding, but that hiding definitely came at a great cost. So when I look back now, I've heard often depression equated to the feeling of drowning, this idea of not being able to breathe, and all the while watching everyone around you live and breathe effortlessly. For me, then and now, this is the perfect analogy. The real me was always there. The way I think about it now is she was just painfully suffocating below the surface of the water. And I think one of the interesting things that happens with so many folks on this journey is everything I was frantically building to protect this quote unquote normal facade just ends up adding more and more and more water to that pool. So through these years, the culmination of this constant stress made me often, or think often about suicide, made me plan for ways I was going to do it. And to this day, I honestly still have an incredibly hard time talking about it, because it scares me now on the other side of it, to remember how convinced I was that that was the only option at that point. That thought and that feeling that I don't think you ever forget, is my biggest motivator to do the psych stuff and be able to support others on this journey, is to be able to sit beside other people and kind of say, I get it, but I promise on the other side of this, there is good. And I think the other thing in this community that the bias that, like, for me, it was never about this idea, to get back at people for not seeing who I was, or seeing that true gender. But for me, it was really about this desire to turn my brain off. I was so exhausted, through all those years of this constant kind of cognitive load of trying to figure out how to get out of this. I was so incredibly lucky to live in a home and a family that was supported in every other way. So every time things got close, there was something that ended up pulling me back. So life carried on, and absolutely when I least expected it, I met Jen. So Jen, I met in grade 9. Our last name started together, so we had our lockers together because it was organized by last name, or by alphabetically. And so I met her in grade 9, and by grade 11, I had fallen completely in love with her. She just didn't know that at the time. So like you do in high school, you wait for that big special day. So I waited for Valentine's Day because that would be perfect. And worked up the courage to ask her out. I'll never forget the day I walked up to her at school in the hallway, and I had, fumbling words, and asked if she would like to go out with me. And she looked up at me with big brown eyes and smile, and politely said, "No, thank you," was the only thing she said, and then walked around me and went back to class. But for some reason with Jen, I didn't let that deter me. And a few weeks later, I ended up writing her a letter, and it was just focused really on just wanting her to, to share how I felt. And I told her that if it was still no, then I would leave it alone and respect that decision. But luckily for me, the second time she said yes. So one of the privileges I have had has been absolutely the gift of, I have spent most of my life with the love of my life. We have been together every day since, and from that point, we took every single adult step together and really worked together to build a good life. We finished high school, we moved away from home, went to university, and both started careers in Alberta. At that point, we had been with each other every step of the way, and knew almost everything about each other. So in the months following our wedding, we began to start talking about having a family, and having kids and being parents was something that both of us had always been really excited about the idea of. And at this point, when we got married, we had been together for about 10 years at that point. Leading up to this, I certainly was still very much struggling with this part of me that I had no idea how to explain to myself, let alone her or anyone else. And again, grounding us in the time, I didn't have a lot of internet, or the information, the vocabulary to even explain it to myself, or I had definitely not accepted any part of it myself, and just was trying really hard to just live with the challenge. But as we worked up to this decision about children, I came to this realization that I absolutely love Jen. And I became really mindful that I didn't want to start a family before telling her some element or aspect of what was going on. I wanted to try and be truthful in any way I could possibly be. And I decided at that point that it was this decision. It was definitely my all or nothing moment in my life. Was risking losing the love of my life, to be honest. And I believed so incredibly deeply at that point that if she didn't understand, nobody ever would. So I didn't know it at the time, but really risking that relationship with her, to my best friend, my person, was really that first small step towards the top of my pyramid. Sorry. Jen was shocked, she was confused, and she was hurt in that moment. She had no idea. She did not see even a little bit of it coming. But I remember in that moment, she was also incredibly compassionate. And the words that came out of her mouth after she found the words, was, she said, there is nothing more fundamental than a person's right to self-discovery. And she said, it really feels to me like you haven't had the opportunity to do that yet. And you need to take the time to do that. So in the weeks that followed that, we decided to kind of keep going. She told me that, with respect to to having children, at that point, we had no idea where it would go. But she said ultimately, she would want children who would see and understand the value in diversity, and would come to accept my truth with compassion, whatever that ended up being. Her reaction in that moment, and the door, that door of hope that she opened, I was not in a good place in the day before this conversation, and I had a plan for the next day if the conversation went the way it did. Because of her reaction, I always say, she unquestionably saved my life. I say my mom gave me my first life and Jen gave me my second. And we chose to keep moving forward, just with a complete understanding that we didn't have any idea where it was going to go. Then in 2007, she gave me the gift of my beautiful and amazing Daphne, who is now 16 and not that small. A few years later, my Elliot was born, and just like that, I had these two kids in this family that I had believed was going to be impossible. Throughout this time, becoming a parent, my career, all these competing priorities, my own personal journey was progressing very slowly. I look back now and I appreciate I was cycling between bouts of depression and anxiety to these stretches of confidence that I could somehow find a way to live around my problems. I felt that I had everything I deserved, and like so many of us do, I told myself a million times, just be happy, just be happy. Don't inconvenience anyone else, just be happy. Despite having, the support of Jen and having that person in my life, with time, that internal conflict just became harder to bear, and looking for a solution consumed a great deal of my mental capacity. I started to become mentally absent at home. I rarely slept past 4 a.m. I was always waking with this sick feeling in my stomach and tears in my eyes, knowing I had to start a day as someone I knew I was not. I never felt connected to the person I saw in the mirror or the world around me. And no matter what I tried, I could not see or envision a healthy way out. I continued countless counseling sessions trying to be okay. I tried hyper focusing on my career and anything else I could distract myself with. I obsessively read every book on gender development, medical journals, and websites, believing that if I could somehow just figure out what was wrong with me, I would somehow be able to fix it. I used to have ridiculous thoughts, like maybe there's a little piece of my pituitary gland that they could remove and then this would all be gone. Just trying to get rid of it. So people have always teased me, continue to tease me, that I cannot, and maybe there's others on the call like this, I cannot make a decision in my life without making a spreadsheet. So obviously with something like this, there was no way to spreadsheet your way to an answer. But that being said, it's not that I didn't try. I want to show you, one, my spreadsheet, and two, how patient my therapist was with this idea. So I give you the gender predictor 1000, which doesn't work, by the way, but I tried. So I had built this spreadsheet. More seriously, I built this spreadsheet, and I did this over a year. I kept track every day what was going on with me, and I was hoping that I was somehow going to be able to find a trigger that I could somehow avoid, and then I would be happy. This effort was fruitless, and didn't and never helped even a little bit, but I did it for a long time. The last step in this desperate desire to just avoid being who I was resorting to a bunch of different depression, anxiety medications, which within 5 weeks of this approach left me 50 pounds lighter, dangerously depressed, and the most exhausted I had ever been in my life. And I will never forget the moment I had just given what was, in hindsight, probably the most important presentation. So we were selling assets in the organization. Ended up being like a $2.4 billion sale in the company. I gave that presentation. I walked out of the building. I walked to a park, and I broke. I absolutely broke. I remember sitting in that park downtown in tears and finally admitting that I can't do it anymore. I was not going to survive. I was having this aha moment and realizing that there wasn't a quick fix. There was no pill. There was no quick way around this. And there was no way to run away from who I was. It was in that park, in that moment, that I appreciated that to be happy, I was going to have to put in jeopardy the base of that pyramid and the life I had built so far. And I started to kind of acclimatize and prepare myself to be vulnerable to the possibility of huge loss as I went through this. The 4 years that followed, it was not easy, but it was certainly hopeful. I began to take steps towards self-acceptance. And what was really, really interesting, as soon as I think all of us give ourselves the opportunity and chance to do this, what I found, with more and more permission to explore who I was, I uncovered more and more of that person I had buried. And with time, I became increasingly comfortable with my authentic identity. Ultimately, I learned to love myself. And I think this is one of the most fascinating aspects looking back, is that I would have given any amount of money for the pill to make it go away at the beginning of this journey. And now at the end of the journey, I can't imagine having not gone through the process I have. All of that self-acceptance led to 2015, which was about a decade after that first conversation with Jen. We began to step into many difficult conversations and discuss the idea of transition with our kids and very immediate family. This was obviously a very big positive step, but it was also a very challenging time for other reasons. And I really started to struggle with a lot of guilt. I think for the biggest part for me, out of everybody around me that was going to have to be part of this change, the one person in all of it that was actually losing something was Jen. So I felt all this guilt for taking away the boy she fell in love with and this man she married. When I thought about my kids, I felt so guilty about, this perception of taking away their dad. It all felt so selfish at that time. And if I'm being completely genuine and honest, lots of times there are still small aspects of guilt that creep in with respect to the challenge, the increased kind of difficulty this gives our family in many situations. However, they were my biggest cheerleaders and biggest supporters. And on March 13th in 2017, in one very huge swoop, we braced for impact and we stepped out. We were honest, we were completely vulnerable, and we didn't hide a single element of our family's change. we took this approach of, we had many conversations of, and got to this point in the journey of, we can do this in spite of people, or we can invite people into the change. And we took this much more kind of empathetic and process of inviting people in and giving people time to acclimatize and navigate it with us. In exchange for that approach, for the vulnerability, for the openness, we were shocked to find that friends, acquaintances, and even strangers jumped in with these unguarded moments of their own in this bid to love and support us. All of the decades of doom and gloom, fortune telling that we had obsessed over for years never happened. All of the people that we thought wouldn't be in, or would not be in our lives anymore, hugged us harder, supported us more, and even trusted us to support them in their own journey of self-actualization, whatever that meant for them. I spent, my entire life running away from this. And, through that time came up with a million reasons why I shouldn't, why I couldn't be myself. Every single part of this absolutely terrified me. But now looking back, I realized that willingness to be vulnerable, that willingness to take big chances, take big swings, whatever that means to you, has led to this life that literally feels like a dream most days. I'm feeling like I'm living my impossible. So this is the change that I thought I could never do. This, I love these photos because they're from a board photos organization I'm part of, and it's 3 years apart is how fast kind of this, or 2 years apart, this change happened. The other photo I want to show is when I think about the impossibility of family. This was the first night that our family was out together after transition. And it was just, I love this picture because it's this great reminder of this thing that we were all so scared of, and then ended up being one of the most beautiful moments and nights, and set this foundation for everything that is now. So I want to leave with just a couple kind of big learnings that I got from it, from this experience. The first of those is what I believe now, and this is for all of us, is that in those first few seconds of every day before life starts, we all see what we need and what we want to be in our life. And then what I think happens is the day starts, and whatever reality we're living piles on top of us, and we spend the rest of our day convincing ourselves why we can't do whatever we saw in those first few seconds. For me, it took 30 years to just simply listen to what I heard at 4 a.m. every single morning. It was hard, it was full of uncertainty, and it had the potential of huge loss, but it was worth it. Those are the moments that get us to the places that we need to be. The other thing I want to share is the moment that I realized that this was never about being trans. So I got this email, received this email from a colleague who I didn't know before transition, but I have got her permission to share it. And her and I have become good friends since. So I got this email from her about a week after my transition. And this is one of many stories that came out after. And the lesson I got from this email was, first of all, you never know whose life you're going to change by standing up and having the courage to take control of yours. After all of those years of counseling, all of the reading, it ended up being her email that really, really made this crystal clear to me. So what she did is she reached out. She said, I'll support you, all those things. I'm so excited for you. And then this is what she shared. She's in an abusive marriage, and with her young child, and gave all these reasons that she couldn't leave. And I remember sitting on the couch reading this email, and all of those same words popping out that I had said to myself about why I couldn't make the change I needed. And then I got to the bottom of her email, and where she says, then I heard your story and the letter you wrote, and I thought to myself, if she can do this, then I can do this. And so I did. This was March 3rd, or March probably 15th or 18th. And she immediately signed a lease for April 1st, and her son got out of this situation. There have been so many stories like this that have come, whether it's people quitting jobs and doing different jobs, or just taking control of what is authentic and happy and meaningful for them. So my biggest, learning is this idea of take what you need from this world, and while you're doing that, support those around you who you are doing the same. Whatever your truth is, trust that it can work. This world is an enormous place, and I mean, every person in our life that we lost, they were replaced with 5 others that are better relationships and bring more depth to our life than the person that walked away did. So it's really been a beautiful experience to see how amazing the world actually is. So just trust that, and trust that you can be part of that world. Okay, so the very last thing I want to do is I want to ask for 2 favors from all of you. The first of which, over the last year or two, certainly the challenge for the transgender diverse community is going the wrong way. It's getting a lot more challenging than it is getting better for many folks. My belief so often is that we can change minds with conversation. We can change minds with storytelling. And more than anything, you never know who's listening. So by actively kind of being a voice, sharing a story, always trust you don't know who else is around you that is hearing and feeling affirmed by you sharing. So what I ask folks to always do after this is, when you walk away, choose at least one person. And this is the homework that I don't know if you'll do it. If you want to email me and share a conversation that you had with someone, for sure do that, because that's fun. Take it away, have one conversation with at least one person in your life about this talk, about gender diversity, about, geez, I didn't know this, I didn't understand it, now I do. All those kind of conversations can be helpful. The second and last thing, to circle back to where we started, is this isn't just about being trans. This is about authenticity. The trans community does not own, doesn't have the patent on authenticity. I believe, and I'm passionate. I call myself much more of an authenticity advocate than I do a trans advocate. So for yourself, the second thing I want you to do is, for yourself, when you wake up tomorrow, in those first few seconds of the day, pay attention to what you see. And if what you see is different than the world you're about to step into, do one small thing to get you closer to your truth. Because I believe if we are all doing that, that gets us to the world that we all actually want to be part of. And with that, I will say thank you and open it up for any questions.
Can you hear me if I talk?
Yep.
Okay. I'm using like an earbud, and I haven't ever spoke on it. I've only ever listened. I really appreciate you sharing your story, and I think having that unconditional support of your spouse sounds like such a gift. To have that. I also have 2 girls and 2 boys. So I'm the mama of 2 girls and 2 boys. And the reason I joined the Camrose Friends and Family group was because we kind of have a little boy who's kind of gender questioning. So
right.
that was kind of our experience with that. So kind of talking to people about why he's wearing dresses, or just being okay with that. I'm also from Saskatchewan, so I really
Oh, cool.
I'm a Saskatchewan,
Lots of
from
connections.
southern Saskatchewan, southern Saskatchewan, and a reluctant Albertan.
Yeah, fair enough.
So yeah, I just really appreciate hearing your story, and like having those safe spaces to land, like in your marriage and in your family. Yeah, that just is a really encouraging thing for me as a parent and as a child.
I think it's a good point. Like, I think from I've obviously focused on it a lot in just the mental health, childhood development stuff in my schooling and masters and stuff. And it really is, my belief is kids are super resilient. They can get through a lot, but it's the analogy I always use is like, all of us need a place to land. And so if you've got a gender creative kid or gender diverse kid, it's like they just need one place that's safe. That will get them through it. It's the stat is like, one supportive adult cuts their risk by like 3 times kind of. It's incredible. So yeah, for me, it was my family, for sure. Outside of my Jen and the kids, like other family was more challenging for a while, but we got there. We eventually got there. As soon as everybody realized it wasn't going away, they're like, okay, well, I guess we need to figure this out. Yeah.
Right. Was there anything in particular that like your family did, or your parents did, or your spouse did that kind of gave you that safe spot to let?
I think for kids were huge, right? Kids just see it. So, it's so easy. Like our biggest fear was communicating it to the kids, and it had to be the most anticlimactic conversation and experience in all of it. Like they just got it. Like my son was worried about whether or not I could play Xbox with him after. As soon as we like sat down and played Xbox after, he was good, right? Like it was very, very simple. I think with Jen and I, it was really this, the best advice we got was we followed this kind of truth of today model. So we had somebody that supported us, or a friend who just, I was sharing this with Nancy before. One of the mottos we had going through it, or the affirmations we had going through it, is so often when we're looking at this change, there's like we fear different. We're all biased to think different's going to be bad. And we would always say this comment to ourselves. We'd say, okay, the future is going to look different, but different doesn't mean bad. It just means different. So that was one big thing I think that her and I just really aligned on. We got really, really good at communicating. Like in hindsight, we're really good communicators now, and we know how each other's doing in it. And with respect to our marriage, what we did is just really it was day by day. We would literally have kind of every week or two these truth of today. So we didn't promise each other the future. We just said, let's keep going. And if at some point it's not working, then we'll be best friends kind of. And whatever it's been, 6 years later, it's still, our truth of today is still positive. So
that's a really good motto and way to think of things, because I think even in parenting sometimes it's easy to jump ahead and be like, what's this going to look like, or how are we going to navigate it? But like the truth of today really just like keeps you in that moment.
Yeah. The other really big thing is in hindsight is that and I said it a little bit with the people that left relative to people that came, is that when you've got a big change kind of on the horizon, whatever that transition could look like, it's very, very, very easy to know, and the things that you might lose are very, very tangible. So when you're making that list of what could we lose, your list of all the things you can lose is going to be longer, because you don't have a line of sight to all the things you're going to gain because of it. It's like so many people and families that are in our lives now we would never have connected with. And they are way deeper, way more important, impactful relationships. We're so worried about how it would impact the kids, and to see now like these little teen advocates, and they're the kids that other kids go to for support, and there's just been so much benefit to it, more than anything. And if you ask Jen, like her perception or her perspective is neat at this point, she said like what she realized in the long run is it was opposite maybe what most people think. She's like, if you hadn't done this, we probably wouldn't be together. Because she's like, I could not live with somebody who was that hurting and sad and just not being who they are. So it was this very kind of counterintuitive thing in our marriage as well.
Yeah, like it sounds like you maybe thought it would end it, and really it would have maybe the opposite would have happened.
Yeah, it would have been the opposite. Yeah. I remember her saying to me, she's like, I married somebody who could figure anything out. She's like, figure this out. That's what's bothering me. Right? Is that you're letting this thing kind of get you.
Thanks for sharing.
Of course. Thank you for sharing and for coming and bringing a baby. That's always fun.
Yeah.
That makes my Thursday.
She kind of goes everywhere with me.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
people fixate on questions to trans individuals about the surgery aspects, and I'm not
Yeah,
really interested in that at all. But I was really struck by your photo, the the 2 year difference photo. Can you talk a little bit about how your face goes through such a
sure.
radical change?
Sure. Yeah. And I can talk about it because it was what am I trying to say? It was kind of, we approached it with um lots of comedy in our household, because Jen in particular thought it was very, very funny, lots of the changes that happen. Because essentially you go through puberty as like a 35-year-old instead of a 13-year-old. And so, yeah, the first thing, so when you start, if so, I want to just go back to where you start, is the surgery piece for sure is kind of a gender affirming step that folks can take or not take, or whichever. And whether or not somebody's done anything in that realm has no kind of bearing on their identity or whatever. It's a very personal decision, which I appreciate you for acknowledging. So the difference between the photos, all that was different there was HRT, was hormone replacement therapy. So as all of us are aware of, I'm sure hormones are very, very powerful little little pills and things in our bodies. So the first thing that happens when you start HRT, going assigned male at birth to female, is there's a process called fat redistribution, is what they call it, which is exactly as funny as it sounds. So essentially what happens is a lot of the fat that assigned male at birth they'll keep in their face, all of that kind of just falls out of your face, and it ends up in the other places, your thighs and your you start building fat in different places, which was a very, 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 very interesting process. But the other thing with HR2, and because it's a big topic in the trans community, and lots of people, there's a lot of misunderstanding around it. So HRT includes two different things. So it's one part of it is blocking a hormone, and one part of it is adding a hormone. So I want to use the opportunity to talk about youth, because one of the biggest kind of biases in the media is this idea of we shouldn't be transitioning kids. In Canada, nobody's medically transitioning kids. What we're doing in Canada is we're providing a blocker to kids. So we're kind of pausing puberty is the objective, which then gives them the opportunity to figure it out. It gives them some extra time and space to figure out who they are. If they get to 17 or 18 years old and they decide that their sex they were assigned at birth is congruent with their gender identity, you remove the blocker and they would go through puberty as they would have a few years earlier. What's been shown from a research perspective is that is the most impactful harm reduction strategy we can use for gender creative youth. So just to use the opportunity to educate on that very huge biased misunderstanding in this world. And then as far as the value of doing that, obviously, is that those youth then don't develop secondary sex characteristics. So lots of times, lots of the gender affirming steps and surgeries after are removing secondary sex characteristics. So you can actually save somebody quite a bit of trauma by just giving them the opportunity to figure it out. I shared my experience of going through puberty. It's the exact same thing or very similar for many others. I shouldn't say exact same thing. And if we look at all of the mental health statistics in youth, as far as suicide, substance, anxiety, all those things, they peak in that 11 to kind of 13, because that's when those kids start developing secondary sex characteristics, which is very, very hard to navigate. If it is the way I always explained it, it was just like that time where your body's just feels like your body's literally working against you every single day, and you can't escape that. What was interesting for the hormone journey for me was some of the funny parts. I remember the doctor giving it to me, and his question to me, he said, he knew our family quite well. And he said, did Jen get sick when she was pregnant with the kids? And I was like, yeah, for the first few weeks. And he's like, handed me this prescription. He's like, okay, well, you're going to know what she felt like, because it's when you start on doing the hormone switch, it's actually very equivalent to kind of morning sickness for the first few weeks of it. And then different parts of my body just got jiggly. I remember walking down the stairs and my thighs were jiggly and it felt all different and weird. And I'm like, what the hell? And Jen's sitting on the couch laughing her ass off. She's like, welcome to womanhood, sweetie. You have to be on the bike twice as long now. So we had lots of fun. And I always say it gave me so much patience when my daughter got to that age, because I was like, I feel like I was old enough when I was going through it to know why I was being so nutty, but had a little bit more self-control. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah,
it's fascinating that like hormone in our body can make such powerful changes.
Yeah.
The speech pathologist in me wants to know if taking the hormones changed your voice quality, or like how you sound, or if I worked with a speech pathologist in Edmonton that kind of focused on working with transgender people on voice modification. Did you notice a change, like in your voice as well as in your body?
Yeah, when you're going from, like, when you're assigned male at birth, trans female, you would know this. Your vocal cords have already stretched, so you don't really get, like, if you're going assigned female at birth to trans male, so doing that switch, then your voice definitely changes. I didn't see any changes, and I totally appreciate for many people, certainly, that I support. Voice is a really, really big, a big aspect of the gender dysphoria and the whole piece. The gift that I had in it was my son, to be honest with you. And along that journey, I certainly started in this place of, I wanted to kind of get through the transition and then like disappear, almost kind of quote unquote disappear into the other gender. And it was really through that process. So it was meeting other families was the first part. And I friends with a family who ended up losing a child to mental health and suicide, and in the space. And it was in that moment that I was kind of got to my, like, pardon my language, but kind of my like fuck it moment with respect to seeing that somebody just had to, we need more people just standing up and say, you know what, I'm trans. I'm okay with just being trans and people knowing I'm trans and all the different things. Because I think for me, there was nobody other than celebrities that you could point at to say, there's people living normal lives as trans people, like, and that was huge. So that was part of it. The other thing that happened was that as we were navigating it with our kids, one of the one challenge my son had was, we made literally a handshake agreement, where he said, I don't want your voice to change. And I was tucking him in one night. It was very simple. I was tucking him one night. He said, they call me, through the transition, they switched from daddy to Dee, so they call me Dee now. And he looked up at me, and he was probably, I don't know, like 8 probably. And he said, Dee, I don't want your voice to change. And without any thought, I said, put out your hand. And I shook his hand and I said, I promise it won't. I promise I don't have to change, or I won't change my voice. So I had this kind of gift of never having to, and lots of times you get this, you stand up and you introduce and you get like kind of the second guess, but I kind of just trained myself to reconsider what that means. It's like that person's now met somebody that's not the binary, and that's a good thing for our society, not a bad thing.
Right. Yeah, like not necessarily having to pass or change everything about you in that way.
Yeah.
I love that.
One of the books I always give folks going through it is a book called Nobody Passes. And I love it because it's this whole idea, of because that's always a really, really big question for people navigating. They're like, I want to pass, I want to do this, and just like thoughtfully digging into what that actually means. And the thing that actually allows people to pass is confidence. If you're confident and like that, people attack insecurity in people. If you're super confident in who you are, and that's really the goal, getting through it. And so this book's beautiful because it's like, how do you pass? You open like the first page, it's like, nobody passes, get over it. It's kind of the very simple message, which doesn't work for everybody, but it certainly resonated with me.
Lovely.
I don't have children, but I feel like, oops, sorry, you carry on, please.
No, that's okay. I just feel like I've learned a lot as far as like the difference between like the way the hormones, like that it makes sense that the hormones would change depending on kind of the vocal development that's already happened when you've taken them. So I didn't know that. And I also didn't know that the puberty blocker was, because there is that discourse or that mainstream rhetoric about kind of kids. And protecting kids and all of that kind of stuff. And even somebody
So I was going to say, one of the interesting things that, like, and certainly the trans or gender diverse community's frustration with respect to the medical profession is lots of doctors will say, we can't do it, we're not experts, we don't do this. The reality is that the medical community, like GPs, have been doing it for 70 years. Because I always forget what it's called, but when assigned female at birth individuals start puberty too early, so it's like 10% or 8% or something of assigned female at birth individuals will actually start puberty too early. The textbook treatment for that is to put them on blockers until they're 11. It's the exact same process. So there's actually like 70 years of research to show there's no negative outcomes to pausing it for folks. Yeah, it's very, very fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah.
Go ahead, Joanna.
So in trying to understand, I have questioned, what does it mean to feel feminine or to feel masculine? And obviously I'm coming at it through a cisgendered lens. And I'm starting to think maybe it's because of societal expectations or definitions of what those mean. And I ask you about it because you mentioned that, when you saw the pink book and the blue book and you felt more feminine and you figured puberty would solve that. How was that feeling more feminine based on societal expectations? Trying to wrap my brain around that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's kind of that. I think it's looking at the difference between gender identity and gender roles is essentially, I think, maybe so gender roles are very, very much societally constrained. So girls can do certain things, boys can do certain things. I think for me at that age, it certainly wasn't an expectation. Like there is just this innate sense of who you are. It's the reason I like using that kind of first few minutes of the morning analogy. That's really what it was for me. I think gender identity, explaining gender identity diversity to folks is the hardest one to explain, because it is it's just that innate sense, right? It's that innate sense. So if you wake up in the morning before anything else is going on, it's just who you feel you are, right, in that moment. And for me, it was never, I didn't identify with my body. It didn't feel right. It just felt it felt gross. One of the really interesting things talking about hormones was one of the most powerful things about the HRT shift, which was completely unforeseen, was just body scent. I will never forget the morning I rolled over and smelled and just got the smell of my pillow and smiled. I was like, oh, okay, that's right. It's really, really hard to explain that. From a biological perspective is the other way you can think about it, because many people don't know that our body and brain are kind of in the medical world, they call it sexed. So our brain is actually sexed at a different point in development, in prenatal development, than our body. So it's 15 weeks is kind of when mom gives the baby a flush of hormones, which actually kind of quote unquote, I don't like using that word, but genders their sexes the brain. And what lots of the research has shown is what can interrupt or inhibit that is cortisol. which is the stress hormone. So if mom's under a whole bunch of stress during that time or something happens, and so maybe like I would be careful because it's very circumstantial, but I one of the jokes I always make is I always blame my brother why this happened to me, because when we were kids, when my mom was pregnant with me, my brother was 2 years old, and it wasn't quite 15 weeks. It was like 17, I think, 16 or 17 weeks. My brother he was 2 years old. He was with my grandpa on the farm, and he wandered off, and he was gone for 24 hours. And they had helicopters and dogs and all these people kind of looking for him. So I always share with him that it's his fault because he gave mom all this stress during that time. But so yeah, I think that the reality, you can approach it so many different ways. I think if you the other example I always use in when we're doing gender diversity training is, and I've done this with hundreds of people, is we have this bias and this perception that there is just two, the very binary belief of gender. I don't love it, but I'm very prepared for the biology argument in those sessions, because I've done the training all over the place, including Texas last year, which just came up a lot. And so if you use even just the biology argument, there's actually six biologically definable sexes in the human species. And so the way that I always ask that question in big group settings is I get people to put up their hand if you've had kids. And then the second question I ask, I say, leave your hands up. And if you have had kids, how many people have had their kids genetically tested when they were born to figure out what their gender was? And I think in all those hundreds of people, there's been one person who left their hand up, and they had them tested for a different reason. But there's this reality that we create this self-reinforcing belief that there's only two. Even in biological sex, there's diversity. There's a wide spectrum. If you look at it globally, from a global population, it works out to about 3% of the world's population aren't or don't fit the binary definitions. And so, which doesn't sound like a lot, but there's a really good YouTube video that puts it in context. If you do the math, that's 190 million people. And if you put all of those people into their own country, it would be one of the top 10 most populated countries in the world. And then I always make the joke, it would also be a very fun country. I think a lot of people would vacation there, because if you've ever been to Pride, I think it would be a very fun country to vacation. So I'm not sure if that helps. Identity is a really, really hard one to explain. I think to get to the root of your question, it wasn't I wanted to be like her so I could do the things that she did. It was more, I didn't identify right up to when I had surgery. That was like the biggest relief in my life to just get through that and get past it. So it's hard to explain other than to say, looking back on it, I have zero doubt now that it was the right thing and what I needed to do. Rebecca.
Thank you.
I just first, before I get into my comment, I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your story and for facilitating this conversation and answering questions. I very much appreciate the environment you've created and that you've shared all of this with us. I just wanted to add to the conversation of like the categories and the gender binary, because I've taken a lot of classes, I've done a lot of my own personal journey, and I do identify as non-binary after growing up in a very categorized, very gender-based system within my family. And really, I see gender like male, female, like masculine, feminine. They are just categories that society assigned to try to understand those things. And it's much easier to make 2 boxes to put things in than 100 different boxes to very precisely sort everything, as much as like that is the way that I think it should be done. But that's kind of what really started my process of thinking about all of that. Was I didn't agree with those boxes and I didn't feel like I fit into those boxes. So that was my own personal standpoint, and that's kind of what helped me to grasp that gender binary. And then from another personal note, Joanna, I think you should consider taking or talking to, oh my goodness, I can't remember. Janet Wazelius, there we go. She teaches a philosophy class of sex and gender, and she talks about a lot of those topics. And I took it and I absolutely loved it. And it really helped a lot of my own understanding and helped me look at a lot of these different topics. And again, start my own journey and start processing a lot of that too. So if you wanted to chat more about it, though, you can always send me a message. You know how to reach me. But yeah, thank you again, Kirsten.
That's awesome. That's an awesome share.
Thank you.
Another perspective too that helped me a lot, that I was really grateful to have learned, to have a friend that shared a lot of this with me, is the other way to think about it's why we've ended up with the binary is very much a colonial kind of introduction in North America. But very interestingly, North America is one of the only continents in the world that doesn't have a third option for gender. So a lot of other cultures have always had an alternate that isn't kind of the binary. One of the best learnings I had was looking at pre-colonial Indigenous beliefs around gender and sexuality. And what was really, really interesting in that learning is pre-colonial Indigenous cultures looked at it in the opposite way that the colonial culture did. So in colonial cultures, I need to know what you are so that I know where you fit in society. So I need to know what your gender is so I know what role you fill in society. Perfect. So that's rooted right in the very beginning, right? Women are meant to have children, or men are meant to provide for families, et cetera, et cetera. In pre-colonial Indigenous culture, and a lot of other Polynesian cultures similar, and a few others, Indonesian, there's a few that are like this, where I look at what you can bring to our community. And I decide what role you fill based on what you can bring to the community. So I think of your role first. And if we think of role first, then somebody's gender becomes pretty irrelevant in needing to understand it, which I think is a really, really beautiful teaching I got received from the Indigenous world. And certainly was huge in helping me in my own self-acceptance to say, like, it's really the only places in the globe that it's the two boxes are that rigid. The other perspective, maybe I'll share just in that theme, because I don't know if anyone's read Jenny Boylan, but Jenny Boylan she was the president of GLAAD for a few years. She's she's my rock star in the States, and certainly was hugely influential on my journey. I saw her getting interviewed one time, and they asked her a question around something about is it frustrating, that people are always trying to understand what it's like to be trans, or do you believe something around that theme? And she's a really, really funny woman, and she kind of smiled and looked at them, and she said, I think we start in the wrong order in our society. She's like, we've got this approach of, I need to understand what it's like to be trans in order to love somebody trans. And then she had this very, very powerful moment. And she's like, why not just flip the equation around with people? Why not just choose to support and love somebody? And if you choose that direction, you appreciate and realize very, very quickly that you don't have to understand what it's like to be trans. Or whatever it is somebody is going through. We don't have to understand each other's experiences to be compassionate, to be empathetic, to care for people. And so it's almost just kind of that work. And I still am always doing that work with people from all, different experiences, is just position it differently. I'm going to choose to support you. And if I ultimately understand where you're coming from, great. If I don't, I'm still supporting you because this is authentically who you are.
I don't have any children, but I tease with lots of people in my life who have children, that I have lots of parenting tips if they need them. But it strikes me that one of the things that I think is happening a little bit better, a little bit differently, generation after generation, is this kind of notion of very intentional parenting, because it feels like a lot of the difficulty in in this example, being trans, is this sense of shame and fearing fearing disappointing parents. as a fundamental reason why people either don't do it or hide it or delay it significantly. Um, how would you talk to young parents about that?
Yeah, I think it's you and I were chatting a little bit before. I think what we've run through Airdrie Pride, we've run a parenting group for the last 6 years. So I've had this gift of just kind of on the sidelines of lots of families' journeys in this space. And it's the first thing I always say is that, as you know, I've got 2 kids. Everything I know and understand about this community, if one of my kids came forward and needed to go through this, I would obviously support them 1,000 times, but it would still be hard. It would still absolutely be hard. It's the mourning the loss of what was or what you think is going to be with this kid or with your kid, and appreciating, again, what I said, what our motto was, is the future is going to look different, but different isn't necessarily bad. So the first thing I always work through with parents is open yourself up to that process. It's a grieving process. It's you have to kind of work through that. And if for any of us, if we resist that, it's kind of like the kid pulling on your sleeve at the grocery store. If you ignore them, they're pretty much going to have a temper tantrum at some point. So that's our own mental health will be the little kid. So I think it's really, really important to connect yourself with supports to work through it. Because there's this unfortunate reality, I think, to it that I remember my mom had a really, really hard time with it. And one of her best friends said, they were having coffee, and she shared this with me years later. She said, what if you haven't seen the best part of your kid yet? And that was what it took for my mom to kind of step back and say, interesting. Like, she had this perception of loss and all of this stuff, and her best friend in the world said, what if you haven't seen the best part of your kid yet? And that gave her kind of a little bit of hope. But I can share a little bit about that, because I liked, it's important to me to normalize the challenge for parents, because even as I'm not one of those those trans people who says, you're not losing your kid, you're whatever, blah, blah, blah. It's like, it's a change, and navigating change is hard. I always share the story of my own mom. So I told my parents, and the day I told them, we didn't have another conversation about it for 2 years. So 2 years went by before they brought it up or were willing to talk about it again. And the reason it came up again is that they're still in Saskatchewan, and they got, obviously our kids and grandkids and stuff. And I said, we got to the point as a family, it was actually my daughter, speaking of the amazing part of kids, where my 11-year-old daughter at the time said, don't pretend anymore. Like, you be who you are, right? It was kind of her push. So I phoned my parents and I said, we'll come home for Christmas, but we're only going to come back if, like, I'm just coming as me. I'm not going to pretend anymore, and et cetera, et cetera. And my mom was right away, what about your brother? What about whatever, blah, blah, blah. And I said, give me a call back in a day or two, let me know, but it's no longer an option. I'm not going to kind of hide to make everybody else comfortable. And so she did the work and reflected and talked to whoever and said, okay, fine. It was just super uncomfortable. Christmas at family is sometimes uncomfortable anyway, but this was very uncomfortable. Went back, and the way that it happened is lots of families stayed away because they were worried or whatever, but it ended up in this beautiful day of mom and I spending the day in the kitchen making Christmas supper or whatever. And if you had to ask her now, I remember after that, she said, I wish we had done this 2 years ago. She's like, I just needed to know nothing was different. And being that we were apart in distance, it was just too hard for her to see that nothing was actually going to change. And so she totally got there, and now my parents or so many other people in my life say, I can't imagine it any different. Like, now I'm at this place that I can't imagine you as anybody else. And I think when we look at families that have, the beauty of doing that group for 5 or 6 years, if we've seen families go through the entire thing. And now when parents come, there's other parents there that say, yeah, I get it. It was hard, but now I can't imagine this teen as anybody else than who they are. So it's just that, you know, there's lots of psychology around change fear and all those sorts of things. And the unfortunate reality, we can define it, we can put all the definitions to it in the world. The unfortunate reality is we just need to work through it. It's the Brene Brown thing. It's like the only way to positive change is very, very often through some pretty hard stuff. Does that help? I don't know if that helps. I think what's counterproductive is when people tell parents, you're not losing your kid, just get over it, just support them, just whatever. It's just like we all need support. There's that, I don't know if anyone's seen that Gillette commercial. It's a really good commercial on the individual transitioning and shaving for the first time. And there's a quote in that, it's a Gillette commercial, so I'll validate that, but it's a really, really beautiful quote in that commercial about how it's not just about him transitioning, it's about everyone around him transitioning. And I just love that, because I love that it's about, for me, it was about all of us. It wasn't just about me. If a kiddos or a youth's going through it, it's about everybody. It's about friends, it's about teachers, it's about family, it's about whoever.
There's a chat kind of question comment from Andrew, and then we might need to wrap the session up. So he says, very enlightening talk. I liked how you made your story relatable and very applicable for different situations. I wonder, could gender transition possibly be compared with religious conversion? Say if one grew up Christian and then became Muslim as an adult, for example. Just curious, and sorry if it's a silly question. Greetings from Treaty 8 territory in the Peace region. Also studying library science at Dalhousie. Forgot to mention that at the beginning. Was a little shy. Very engaging presentation once again.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's hard. My hesitation in saying they would be similar is religion is a belief system, right, versus an identity. I mean, it's part of our identity, so I got to be careful how I say that, but it's you know, it's a piece that we believe in, whereas identity is just such a hard thing. Like, if maybe answer it from like a human development perspective, is our gender identity is developed between the ages of 3 and 8. For those that maybe don't know that is very, very often confused with sexual identity. But our gender identity actually develops much earlier. So roughly 3 to 8 years old in 3 different stages. So gender awareness, gender exploration, and then gender constancy. When we think of things like our belief systems, and those things start to kind of become much more relevant later in our development, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's one of in the teaching, that the course that we do, we have this funny little part where we talk about the love-hate relationship of the acronym, you know, the LGBT or 2S LGBTQ. And it goes on forever. I always make the joke, it's the perfect password, because it's always changing. We never remember what it is, and it's got a special character. And so I share that I think the beauty of the acronym is, and what most people don't really get, is that the acronym itself is supposed to be a tool of inclusion, right? It's the fact that I see a T in the acronym, I know I'm not the only trans person. And so from that perspective, I hope it expands forever. I think the harm that it's done the community is that it mashes together sexuality and identity, all of the letters, and the impact of that in our society. And I think any of the negative news, this is at the root of it. So the impact of that is that we've sexualized identity. So there is zero problem with a trans person using a washroom if we're not sexualizing what it means to be trans. If that makes sense. So the whole root of that debate is because we're sexualizing identity factors. So lots of the teaching we do is actually pull those two things apart in every way, developmentally, what they mean, how they relate. They're separate things for every one of us, whether you're in the queer community or not. They're separate facets.
Yeah. Well, I would like to thank you very much for sharing your story today at the Human Library, your courage and vulnerability to share your story. I mean, I guess especially at a time when it feels like there's so much unjustified negativity toward and judgment of the trans community. I mean, your sharing is inspiring, and I'm grateful to have the experience to have heard it fully for sure. And in your human book description, you mentioned the struggle you faced during your gender transition. It wasn't like solely about being transgender, but more about this universal need for self-actualization. And I mean, it served as a reminder to me that we do all have a common goal, like to be our authentic selves and living fulfilling lives, regardless of our sexuality or our age or our ethnicity or our gender or anything. And it's kind of unfortunate, I guess, that as humans, we need reminding of that fundamental bond that does connect us. But it seems that we do. So thank you for that reminder to us. And as I said, I'm grateful for the opportunity to have heard your story. Thank you for your courage and your willingness to, educate and inspire. So this is the final session of the 29th Human Library. I must say that I'm, in the meantime, thank you all for participating in this event, and I wish you all the best.